Okay, we are now recording. We're in session 3, and we're going to be taking a look at Heschel in relationship to paths to the divine. I'm going to kind of move this over so we can see all of it. Okay. So let's take a look here. Right. Sorry. Okay. Let's take a look at what he says here, because Heschel puts God front and center. In God in Search of Man, which is his initial and his primary work, primary in the sense that this is what really kind of brought him to public notice. He says the central thought of Judaism is the living God. And that's the perspective from which everything else is seen. And the supreme problem in any philosophy of Judaism is, what are the grounds? On what basis may we believe in the realness of the living God? So he starts with God. He doesn't start with how do we come to God. He starts with the idea of the living God. By the way, that's where Buber started as well, in terms of what he called an I-thou relationship. Now, he says something interesting about the way we often approach religion. That most of us sort of think of religion as, or Judaism as, something that's been received. And the question is, can we be loyal to the tradition? Can we be loyal to the events that occurred and obedience to Scripture? And he says, if you think that that's what Judaism is about, you're overlooking the nature of who we are as human beings. Because a great event, if it happened only once in the past, won't dominate us. We need something present. We need something in our own lives. You can't have ease and repose on ideas which have become habitual. As important as habit might be for Aristotle and for Maimonides, and even Heschel will talk about that, it's not sufficient. We can never leave our concern behind in the safe deposit of opinions. It's a very interesting image, because as you know, if you want to get into a safe deposit box, you need keys, sometimes 2 keys. So you have to find a way to keep our own amazement alive. And he identifies 3 starting points for how we think about God. And he will say that these are also points that have been articulated by the tradition. He's not saying anything new. The first is sensing the presence of God in the world, in things. And what he really means here is in the world of nature. You'll remember the story I told you. He walked in to give a lecture and he said, "Did anybody see the miracle outside?" And it was the setting sun. So the first is to see the world and to be amazed by it. The second is to see God's presence in the Bible. For Heschel, the language, the text, the words of the Bible were also a way of eliciting a sense and an awareness of God. And he'll come back to talk about that. We'll take a look at that. And the third is through sacred deeds. And it's very important because while he's going to talk about Shabbat and about prayer, both of which are examples of sacred deeds, And notice the language, he doesn't say mitzvah, even though that's what he means. He's writing for people who may not have a specific Jewish vocabulary. But it's this idea of sacred deeds that then leads into the world of ethics. Now, he says this also comes from the way we approach God in our tradition: worship, study or learning, and action. And we have to go all three ways to reach what is an ultimate dimension. The God of nature, that's the sense of wonder, is also the God of history. And the way to know God is by acting, by doing God's will. And so the goal is to create or to inculcate in ourselves a sense of awe. And one of the ways that we can get that sense of awe is actually from other people, standing in the presence of a human being who is the likeness of God. And therefore, the secret of every being is the divine care and concern that's invested in it. Something sacred is at stake in every event, and therefore, who we are in relationship to the other person also helps us to come into context with God. I'm going to stop the screen share, come back to our group, which are 3 pages, and to ask, what does that mean then, to say these are the 3 pathways to God? How do you react to that idea? Don't forget to raise your hand. Esther, you're raising your hand physically, but in the next time, do it by touching the button under reactions at the bottom of the screen. Esther.
Well, one of the 3 was sacred deeds, but I think that's quantitative. Let's say the mitzvah is to have somebody in your house for Shabbat. So if you did the mitzvah, if you invited 1, but it's more sacred if you invited 3 or 4 or 5. So,
I don't think that quantification was so important in that sense. There was an essay that was written recently in honor of his 50th anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Heschel's Yortzeit. And somebody, actually, Rabbi Berman from Thornhill, his brother Todd, wrote this essay. Somebody said, how can you be talking about Heschel? He wasn't Orthodox. And Rabbi Berman goes on to explain that yes, Heschel taught at HUC, the Reform Seminary. Yes, he taught at JTS, the Conservative Seminary. But Heschel himself said, I'm not Jewish by an adjective. The adjective doesn't define me as a Jew.
Okay.
And I think for Heschel, he would probably say that it's not only one deed. It's an accumulation of deeds, but you never know which deed matters. One of the nice things about Chabad, and I have many differences with them, but one of the nice things is the sense that Chabad has of they will meet you wherever you are. They want you to do one mitzvah, and that's it. There are no questions. Now, they may want, in the long run, more than that, but they meet people where they are and try to open a door to a mitzvah. And that's what Heschel is trying to do. Jacob Petachovsky, who taught at Hebrew Union College, quotes Evelyn Underwood, who was a great scholar of mysticism, not of Jewish mysticism, of mysticism. And she says that what a mystic often is trying to do is convey a feeling but you can't convey this feeling, and yet you use language. So the mystic tries to use some sort of evocative language that may help somebody to unlock for themselves the feeling. So it's a bit of a problem, because how do you expect somebody to have this feeling when you can't really convey to them what that feeling is? So you use language in a way to try to help others to, on some level, gather that that feeling. Gary wants to know whether I can provide some color. I'm not sure what that means in this case. I have been watching the NFL lately, so I know that there are color people who do the play-by-play and people who do the color. So I think I understand what you mean. Can I provide some color to the concept of the living God that Heschel refers to? Living in this case means a real sense of the presence of God in my life. It's not the idea of God. Remember, he doesn't want to just talk about theology. He talks about depth theology. It's a feeling that there is something big out there. By the way, the New York Times last week was doing a series of articles about wellness. And one of the things that they said that helps human wellness is the cultivation of awe. And how do you cultivate awe? You look at the sky, you look at the stars, you look at the ocean, you look at the mountains. Now that is a way to have a sense of awe that is not specifically tied to any one religious tradition. There was an essay by John Wisdom many years ago. It's a great essay in analytical philosophy. And Wisdom, in this essay called Gods, says you come across a garden. And one person says, the gardener is away, but is going to come back. And the other person says, there is no gardener.
God is the gardener.
How do you, and Wisdom says you can't really prove it one way or the other. And taking this into the realm of belief, Lewis, can't remember his name, who taught philosophy at Yale at one point, said that if you are a person who has a religious orientation, you will look at the mountains and the oceans and you will say, this is amazing, remarkable, and you will draw a connection to the divine. But someone who is not religiously oriented, not spiritually oriented, can look at the same phenomena and say, wow, this is amazing, but not draw that other linkage. So for Heschel, he believes that drawing that linkage is an essential aspect of how we are who we are. Let me answer Sheila Arkin's question. The texts that I'm sharing with you were sent to you already. And how long the recordings will be viable, I have no idea, but certainly for a while. I'm going to respond to other questions. Friedel?
Thank you. Those were good questions you asked of us. I think in the morning when I say Moda Ani, I'm waking up and thanking God for God's faith in me. That's what the prayer says. I'm alive another day because God has faith in me that I will accomplish God's will. The second thing is Reshit Chachma Yirat Adonai. the beginning of wisdom is awe of God. And I think that is, if you go out open-hearted and open-headed into the world, your sense of awe will be drawn to the people you see, to the objects you look at, to nature. You have to be open to awe. You wake up in the morning, and I guarantee if you want that feeling, please look in the prayer book for the prayer. I open my eyes and I talk to God. It's a great way to start the day.
So I want to just comment, Friedel, at least a large part of the year, goes on walks with her husband Harold and posts a beautiful picture or two every day that is evocative of exactly what she's talking about. So I want to thank you, Friedel, because your posts often open something up for me as well. But the idea of being open is really important, and I'm going to give you an analogy. We know that there is a constant, I'll call it a hum in the universe, that physicists who worked at Bell Labs say goes back to the Big Bang. And Esther, I know your husband also worked on projects with Bell Labs. But we can't hear it unless we have the right equipment. If you have the right equipment, you can tune in. What Heschel is trying to say is you have to develop that capacity. It's not just there. You need to work on developing it. William, Bill. Coach William. Can't hear you.
Yeah, I forgot to unmute.
Okay.
I was going to quote Rashis Chochma Yiras Adonai as well, that I do every morning. And the way that my Rabbi Mendel Kaplan from Chabad Flamingo emphasizes the living God is by pointing out that the ancient release from Egypt actually can be seen as a metaphor for our difficult daily challenges, and that if we sense that we have a partner above, that we can feel more confident in that we can figure it out and rise above our difficulties. It doesn't happen. Didn't happen thousands of years ago. It happens every day.
Yeah, there is a sense in that of divine trust in us. That, of course, is also what Friedel was saying. Shirley.
I just somehow I'd like to distinguish in my mind between feelings like happy, sad, angry, etc., and experience. So to me, it's a mystical experience. It doesn't. I'll never get there by thought. So those two people who look at the mountain, one will actually have the experience of the living God and the other won't. And I don't know if you agree with me, but I think not everybody is capable of having the mystical experience. Their temperament just isn't built that way. They're happy with, the five senses and what they see in the world. And it's good enough for them to lead their lives. And I think we shouldn't drive them crazy trying to have a mystical experience, which you're not capable of having.
I don't necessarily think that Heschel is trying to say everybody should have a mystical experience. But what he is saying is that the sense of awe helps us to,
If you're inclined that way.
if you're inclined that way. I think it was Gene Borowitz, was a great Reformed theologian who also used to actually come and audit some of Heschel's classes. Borowitz said, not everybody can buy that. And crossing that line is already a big deal.
I think it's also a personal attitude. You can
Sure,
train
it's
yourself.
personal.
You
Yes.
can train yourself to appreciate things.
Steve, and then I want to go back to some text again.
So did Heschel write at all about the awe that we observe in very negative events that take place in the world? The mudslides, the tornadoes, how did he deal in his theology and in his thinking? Well, it's not just looking at the beautiful mountains. It's not looking at the wonder of a beautiful birth. What about the birth of the disfigured, of the terminally ill child, that kind of thing? How did he try to incorporate that? I mean, of course, you can still say it's awe, but you get where I'm coming from. It's
I
a very
do.
different kind of feeling, a very different kind of inspiration, and a
So,
different kind of
Hesch-
mystical experience.
So first of all, thank you. Heschel focuses more on human evil than on natural evil. And I really can't answer the question. I think the idea that there's something bigger than us is part of it, but I can't directly answer the question. Someone asked, what would Heschel say about the way we're destroying our planet? I don't know. He has a deep concern for the world in which we live, and he tries to differentiate it, by the way, from the Greco-Roman way of looking at the world and seeing it as useful. And he differentiates it from a scientific way of looking at the world in terms of asking how does it work? But I can't tell you how he would deal with the environmental issues. They were not really being articulated clearly when he was writing. It's really with Rachel Carson's book that we begin to sort of rethink our relationship to the natural world. Lisa Berger pointed out that if you're hungry and cold and in pain, it's more difficult to be in awe. And I think Heschel would agree with that. And that's part of what his orientation toward social justice, to use that terminology, chesed and mishpat, that's part of it, because you have to take care of other people. And that's a priority. Now, he may also be building in some way off of Maimonides. For Maimonides, in order to advance, it's kind of like trying to remember the psychologist who wrote about this. It'll about levels of development. So you first have to take care of your physical needs.
Mhm.
And then you have to take care of.
You're talking about Maslow.
Thank you. Abraham Maslow's development. Thank you very much. It's good to have a psychologist on board too. And gradually then, for Maimonides, only after dealing with the physical and the moral and the ethical, only then can you get to the metaphysical. So there's a way, and I think Heschel, in that sense, even though he had a lot of differences with Maimonides, he also indicates in many occasions his appreciation of Maimonides and his appreciation of Maimonides' focus on God. I'm gonna go back to screen sharing, and we'll go to another text. So I'm going to close this one. And I want to, oh, I see, it vanished. Okay. We're going to go to this, to the idea of revelation. There. Because for Heschel, as I said, the Bible becomes so important. And let's take a look at what he says here. Keep in mind that both at Hebrew Union College and at Jewish Theological Seminary, there were people teaching textual analysis of Bible. They were very concerned with the issues of the historicity of the text. How is the text put together? What do the words mean, etc. And there are many people who, I would say, looked at that and said, you see, the text is really human. Or to use a term that my teacher, Rabbi David Weiss-Halivni, used, the text is maculate, not immaculate. It's maculate. But let's see how Heschel looks at the mystery of Sinai, and particularly the idea of revelation. So what happened at Sinai? He notices that there are two languages. In one, the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai. No sentence has ever said more. God, who is beyond hidden and exalted, is here. But the Bible also says, I talk to you from heaven. That is, God did not descend to the earth. All it was that the words came from heaven. Now, he's going to pick up on this many years later when he actually puts together the book on Torah min hashamayim, heavenly Torah, Torah from heaven, through the lens of the generations. But here, this is the beginning of the idea. The passages don't contradict each other. So for people who are focused on language, it's important to realize revelation is an event. I want to go back to that word event because somebody else used it earlier tonight. It's an event to God and to human beings. In the second passage, God speaks in the first person, and in the first, it's what the people experienced. So the same act has two aspects. And therefore, God did and did not descend to the earth. There's a differentiation between the way we experience something and what it might have been for God. Now he says, the meaning of revelation is given to those who are mystery-minded. Remember I said he uses the word mystery more than anybody else in contemporary Jewish thought. It's not given to those who are literal-minded. And the important thing is not chronological. When was the text put together? But theological. What's important is what happened between God and the prophet, rather than between the prophet and the parchments. Nice language, a nice turn of phrase. We accept the authority of the Tanakh, of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, not because it's ancient, it's Mosaic, but because Moses was a prophet. And then he says something interesting, which is very important, I think, for people who are concerned with the literal revelation of the Word of God. That is the Torah as it is written actually God's Word, which is what might be said. Someone mentioned a particular rabbi, a Chabad rabbi tonight. They might not like this, but Heschel says there's divine inspiration and there's Mosaic authorship. The first part refers to a mystery. The second to a historic fact. The first part you can only allude to. You can express in terms of grandeur and amazement. You can remember his idea last week that we talked about. It's indicative. You can point toward it. The second, the text itself, you can analyze, examine, you can see where it is chronologically. So he's trying to both create space for what people sometimes call biblical criticism or textual analysis. And he's also trying to say, that's not the big issue. That's not what's really critical. He goes on to say, philosophy of religion deals with the first part, that is, the idea of revelation. Its concern is not how the Pentateuch was written down, but rather the meaning and validity of the claim that the will of God reached the understanding of the human. And the Torah is a mirror of that reaching out. The second part, how is it written down, is the concern of theology, not of depth theology, which has to answer all the historical questions. So he says you shouldn't try to read the Bible when it talks about Sinai as if it was systematic theology. Its intention is to celebrate a mystery, to introduce it to us, not to explain it. And he says something very critical that's become, I would say, very important to many Jewish thinkers. That when talking about revelation, the Bible itself is a midrash. That is, the Bible is not a specific account exactly of what happened. It is already one step away, just interpreting what happened, or helping to make us aware of what happened.
Well, isn't it really a metaphor, the Torah?
Well, if you take midrash as a metaphor, but Esther, I'll come back to you in a moment or two. So what is this faith in the sanctity of the Bible? That its words contain what God wants us to know and to fulfill. Some of you are familiar with the introductory bracha to the Shema. Lilmod ulilamed, to learn and to teach, lishmor vilasot, to observe and to do. So it's lilmod ulilamed, lishmor vilasot. How the words are written is not the fundamental question. And that's why he says, referring now to, although he doesn't take them by name, but Orthodox theology, the theme of biblical criticism is not the theme of faith. Just as is the lightning and thunder at Sinai a natural phenomenon or not? He says that is irrelevant. Again, the act of revelation is a mystery. The term mystery keeps coming up, while the record of revelation, that which is actually written, is a literary fact phrased in the language of human beings, just as he said earlier, that one is the voice of God and one is the human account of God. I'm going to stop sharing and go back to our screen so we can continue this discussion. So I can tell you that there are many people who come to study Tanakh, and I'll even say Torah, at an academic level and are shocked by the way scholars, academics will tease out the text. And for some, they reject that approach. For some, the approach is so shocking and disturbing that they find it very hard to maintain a belief in revelation, in God speaking to us. And Heschel is trying to differentiate between the text we receive and the experience or the event of revelation. So I'm going to pause, come back to you. Questions, comments, insights. Don't forget, just hit the little thing with the face, the emoji, for reactions. iPad number 3, whoever you may be. You have to unmute yourself.
How does one, I know that he talks about how do you experience revelation in the current day? I read the first writing that you gave us, and that was about that, but it's a little abstract to me.
So for Heschel, revelation occurred once. Sinai occurred once. But at the same time, he would say, the experience of God can occur anytime. He gives priority to the Sinai experience, that event. But he doesn't deny that it's possible to have something occur to us. The only question is, how do you know what it is? And there's a little bit of a, I would say, there's a part of Heschel's theology that requires a leap. He's later going to say, in Judaism, the emphasis is not the leap of faith, but the leap of action. Because sometimes as you're doing things, you come to a different perspective entirely.
Will that apply to free will?
I'm not sure of the connection, Esther.
Because we have a choice to react to certain actions, right? So if something can be wrong and yet it can be right, for example, if I think of this week's parasha, and why were the Egyptians punished too? Because they were supposed to supervise that they do the work, but they went beyond it. They tormented them.
I don't know, Esther, I can't go into this week's parasha, but
No, but I'm just taking it as an example of free will, our action in what we do.
Ultimately, we bear responsibility for our decisions. And Jerry asks, does revelation imply faith? I think for Heschel, the idea of God speaking to us is not a matter of theological proposition, but it's a matter of a deep sense that God cares about us.
Okay.
You might characterize that as faith. Steve, again, I think this is Steve Tanny, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So it certainly sounds to me like Heschel is downplaying the specifics of the text. In other words, he doesn't seem to be fixated as, most classical kinds of analysts, commentators, the rabbis of centuries, in terms of grappling with the text. Each word, each syllable, each letter. He's differentiating between the idea that there is a text that was somehow communicated prophetically and the specifics of the text. And I find that interesting and potentially problematic because of its dissonance with the majority of the tradition that precedes.
Oh, I don't think that's the case. I think that he's very concerned in another context with a close reading of the text. But where, you remember how he talked what we read last week about polarities. So there's a polarity here. One side or one perspective says the text is a way to an awareness of God, to a feeling about God. And the other says the text isn't so important as the event or the fact of revelation. He wants to claim both. So there's a bit of the tension in that polarity. Other questions, comments? Gerald. You have
Yes,
to
Rabbi,
unmute.
I wanted to ask if the text, the written text, is a midrash. Whose midrash is it?
I think he would say that's the human account of Revelation. So in and of itself, it's the midrash. He's not going to get in, he doesn't get into, did Moses write it down? Was it written down during the days of, or was there various packets of tradition that, E, J, P, and D? He doesn't get into that. That is in some ways irrelevant to him.
No, I understand that, but the implication is that it's a human midrash, that the words are human words, not the ultimate reality of
that is the
God's
implication.
revelation.
But on the other hand, remember, it's a polarity. On the other hand, it's God reaching out to us. And the language becomes the way we as human beings take that experience and put it into language.
But Rabbi, you said,
Wait, Esther, you have to wait. Friedel had her hand up.
I really like the idea of the text as midrash, because my understanding of midrash is that it is a method, from the story, it means literally, and it's a method, I was taught, of cracking open the text so you will understand the meaning better. The second thing I want to say is we have to acknowledge in this conversation that the passing on of the story of the mystery was oral. People didn't have iPads to write down what it is they exactly saw. So it's got to be a compilation of the experience people had. Just because there were no writing instruments. The only written part is what Moses wrote down that God told him, the 10 Commandments. And how Moses recorded the rest of it, we don't know, because that was in the Holy of Holies, not the entire experience. That was
I'm not sure
all right.
that I would agree with you.
All
only
right.
Because, first of all, even the 10 Commandments have different texts. Secondly, because for Heschel, he doesn't want to get into the question of, does the oral tradition precede the written tradition, or as classically, the written tradition precedes the oral tradition. He doesn't want to get into that discussion. For him, what he wants to focus on is the sense of the divine reaching out and becoming something that we as human beings put into words. That for him, it's this, again, is it divine? Yes. Is it human? Yes. Avi, Rabbi Kogan.
Yeah, I just want to respond to the previous comment that that if the words of the Torah are spoken as if in a human voice, that somehow that detracts. It seems to me that the most traditional of medieval commentators, and I think also within the Talmud, we have the phrase Dibra Torah Bilshon Bnei Adam. The Torah speaks in a way that is addressed to human beings and that is geared to be understood and shall we say intuitively absorbed by human beings.
So thank you. I want to emphasize this idea, Dibra Torah Kilashon Bnei Adam, becomes critical for Heschel in describing one pole or one approach to understanding the idea of revelation. The other will be and that is the position he'll associate with Rabbi Yishmael. The other position which he'll associate with Akiva is that the language itself is divine and therefore has the capacity of multiple meanings. And we'll see, we'll get there. We're not there yet tonight. We're going to go to another text, I hope, if I can get us there. And that's going to be, we're going to go here, to God in need. No, I'm closing that. I'm not there. Sorry, we're not there. Hold on. Stop sharing. Share screen. I'm looking for one text and I can't seem to find it. There it is. Okay. We're going to take a look at this because this becomes really important for Heschel. And now this is the opposite in some ways of what we've been talking about, where revelation is God in effect, trying to communicate to us, showing divine care, etc. This is going to come from a lecture of his. And he quotes something from the Zohar that we need each other. Let me try to tell you the background. There's a phrase in the book of Numbers that says Moses comes to appeal to God on behalf of the people of Israel, and he says, Yigdal na koach Hashem, may the power of God be increased. So classical rabbinic interpretation meant, may God's compassion be increased. But there's another element in rabbinic interpretation that creates a midrash there. And the midrash imagines Moses is with God, and he's seeing God busy writing out the words of the Torah. And he doesn't say anything. And God says to Moses, Ein lecha shalom be'ircha. In your city, don't people say hello? Don't they extend the word shalom? And the Midrash has Moses then responding, saying, a student shouldn't speak to the teacher first. Okay, like you don't address the queen until the queen speaks to you, right? And the Midrash then continues. God says to Moshe, you should have added strength to me, that by greeting me and saying, good work, keep going, you add strength to me. So we need each other. Now Heschel picks up that idea. In the phrase, we need each other, is embedded, or that phrase is embedded in the concept of Israel's power to diminish or enhance God's might. So this serves as a cornerstone of Kabbalistic teaching, but it is already alluded to by the rabbis who say that you neglected the God that begot you. Tzur, Natita tzur tishecha. You neglected the God that gave you birth. And the word teshi, neglected, can be understood in the word to be like tishishut, feebleness. Mm-hmm. You weaken the power of the one above. That is, you, human beings, have the power to either give something to God or diminish God. He then goes on to say, he quotes another rabbinic comment, as long as the righteous comply with the divine will, they augment the power above. As it says, and now I pray, Yigdal na koach Hashem. But if not, then Tzur yoladetecha teshi, you enfeebled or you weakened God that gave birth to you. Similarly, he says, we have another perspective, another comment that says, as long as Israel complies with the divine will, they augment the power above. That idea of augment is developed or studied a lot by Moshe Idel. He calls this augmentation theology. That is, you can do something to and for God. And according to the Zohar, this is intimated by Havul Hashem Koach, which we sing sometimes on Friday night, or when we take the Torah or return the Torah. That is, we have the power to give something to God. And now in a lecture, this is what he says. And he obviously uses this idea in his book, God in Search of Man. The idea of God being in need of man is central to Judaism and pervades all the pages of the Bible and of Chazal. Because of this idea, you have to entirely revise all the cliches used in religious language, which seem to say that God is not in need of us. God is transcendent. We are in need of God. God is our projection. He says, no. In the idea of his book, Torah Min HaShamayim, there's a whole section that I have dealing with the Shekhinah. You can't understand the idea of the Shekhinah, which means the divine presence, without the idea of God in search of man. It permeates Judaism. It's missing, though, in our contemporary discussion and in Maimonides' list of dogmas. And now he's going to go back again to the idea of pathos that we talked about last night. The idea of pathos, which is the central idea in prophetic theology, contains the idea of the Shekhinah. That is, that tells us that God is in search of man, which I consider to be the summary of Jewish theology.
Bye-bye.
Now he's gonna, and we're gonna do one little paragraph and then come back to the discussion. This is a dangerously paradoxical idea that not only is God necessary for us, but we are necessary for the unfolding of God's plans in this world. That idea is developed as well, I will say, by Hans Jonas, who is a philosopher of environmental biology, now deceased, who says that particularly after the Holocaust, it's God who needs us, but in relationship to the cosmos, and now I'm going to go back to the question about environment, in relationship to the cosmos, we play a central role in determining the future of the cosmos. It's us who make a difference. And while Jonas only alludes a little bit to God, it's a much bigger idea for Heschel. And it comes up as well in some other modern thinkers, but Heschel and Jonas are the most important. I'm going to close this, come back to our screen. And now I'm interested in your reaction. God is in need of us, which to Heschel is the core idea of Judaism. Maybe not the only core, because he mentions others as well. It's kind of like a kid who says, this is the most amazing thing that I've ever experienced. And the next day, they have something else that's the most amazing experience. But for Heschel, there are at least a few of these. One of them is pathos. One of them is the idea of God in search of man. And there are a few others. But what's your reaction to that?
Well, I think of it.
Certainly not the way most of us were taught about God and humanity. Rosalind, you've got your hand up first.
I think that it imposes a positive obligation of action on people. It's a requirement to engage.
Right. There's no question that does. Hans Jonas is spelled with a J. There's no question that out of that comes human responsibility.
I take it from the sentence B'Tselem Elohim, because we are built in God's image. It's up to us to act on what God wants us to act.
So Heschel quotes at one point a midrash based on a verse in Isaiah, where Yeshayahu the prophet says, "Atem edai nu Hashem," you are my witnesses, says God. And the rabbis comment on that and says, "Imatem lo edai," if you are not my witnesses, ki ilu ani lo Elohim. It's as if I am not God. And Heschel says, you see, in this is the idea that we, as human beings, have a big role to play in determining God's presence in this world, in adding power and dimension to the divine. So it's not only it's not only man's quest for God, which is the book about prayer, but it's also God in search of man, which is the theology of revelation. Shirley Brazier.
I think you've just said what I was thinking, but maybe I'm misquoting you. But if the power of God is love, all love, and if we in the world are acting in such a way that is not loving and even the opposite, then we're diminishing God's power in the world. So that's where our responsibility is, to act in a way that will increase that power of love.
I think that that's true, although Heschel would not limit it to a general principle of love. He was also concerned with specific mitzvot, as we'll see. However, I want to build on what you said, because one of the most trenchant criticisms of Heschel came from Eliezer Berkovitz, who said that Heschel is dangerously close to Christian theology. Berkovitz, I should say, was a great theologian and a great scholar who has played a major role in the Orthodox community. He's deceased now, in opening the Orthodox community toward more empowerment of women. He was one of the two people that I thought of doing a doctorate with Heschel and with Berkovitz. He was also someone who had come out of the German Jewish community, went to England, and then made his way to America. But he had a very critical outlook on Heschel, and that criticism centered around the idea of, if God is in need of us, then that somehow makes it much closer. And the idea of divine pathos, he felt, came dangerously close to Christianity. I don't necessarily agree, but Sheila, you have to unmute yourself.
I'm not sure why, but I find the idea frightening, to have that power. Because not only the good I could do, the harm I could do. I mean, I find it's a frightening idea, and it will require me to do a lot of mind shifting about who God is and who I am in that relationship.
Right. There's no question that in Jewish mysticism, the idea that God, that divine energy, I'll just use this as a kind of metaphor, divine energy comes into the world and into us, and we in turn do certain things that return the divine energy to God. So Terry will correct me if I'm wrong, but in an electric current, that's how it works. That there's this loop quality of electricity, and And it's very much developed in Jewish mysticism. So yes, as Rabbi Kogan says, with great power comes great responsibility. Some of us recognize the source of that quote. As Jerry Fryer says, there's a powerful exchange going on between God and humanity. Etta, please.
So much of prayer, so many of the prayers in the Siddur, especially during Psukei de Zimra, are praising God. Are those prayers considered by Heschel to be strengthening God?
So Psukei de Zimra in particular are all biblical psalms and quotes. So Heschel might say it depends on how you are understanding each verse, because he was a very careful reader. But it is other prayers as well, where we praise God. Brachot are praises of God and acknowledgements of God's role in this world. But yes, Heschel would say that's part of the duality or the exchange. There is a wonderful midrash that Heschel used to cite that looked at the word mitzvah and said a mitzvah is also tzavta. Tzavta, for those of you who recall Israeli folk singing, like Esther, Shira b'tzavta meant singing in a group. Tzavta means together. So for Heschel, that idea that a mitzvah is tzavta is that's where the divine and the human meet. And it is a tremendous sense of responsibility. I want to get to another text, so hopefully we will get there. I want to look at this one, Halacha and Agadah, because we've been talking a lot about mitzvah. And because it's really important to understand this in relationship to an unstated debate that Heschel had with Joseph Soloveitchik, and and a clearly stated critique of Spinoza. So Heschel thought that Spinoza had bequeathed to the Jewish world the idea that basically Judaism is a set of laws for a political polity or a political community that no longer exists. Mendelssohn, Moses Mendelssohn, who lived 150, let's say 100 plus years after Spinoza, Mendelssohn tries to differentiate between Jewish law, which is required, and beliefs which are not so required. And he uses it as a basis for arguing that Jews don't believe something that is against the government. He's trying to argue for a model of Jewish entry and citizenship. Regardless of that, out of Spinoza and then Mendelssohn comes this idea, which comes to dominate modern Jewish thought, which is that much of Judaism is really about what you should do, and you're free to believe whatever you sort of want, or not believe at all. And then it gets, within the Orthodox community, the emphasis becomes on what you do, on mitzvah. Heschel wanted to open that discussion up in an entirely different way. And here's how he does it. To maintain that the essence of Judaism is an idea that comes from Mendelssohn, consists exclusively of halakha, is as erroneous as to maintain that the essence of Judaism consists exclusively of Agadah. Agadah are the legendary parts, the belief parts of Judaism. Halakha without Agadah is dead, and Agadah without halakha is wild. Here, he's being critical of the Reform movement. And now you're going to see these polarities that he develops. Halakha shapes your life according to a fixed pattern. It is a form-giving force. Agadah is the expression of human ceaseless striving, which defies all limitation. Halakha is rationalization and schematization of living that is very much Soloveitchik. It defines, specifies, sets measures and limits, and puts life in an exact system. Agadah deals with man's, here's the word again, ineffable relation to God, to others, and to the world. Halakha deals with details, and Agadah deals with the whole of life. Halakha with the law, Agadah with the meaning of law. Halakha with something that's tangible, Agadah to a realm which is beyond that. Halakha teaches us how to perform common acts, Agadah how to participate. How do we participate in this eternal divine drama? Halakha gives us norms, Agadah a vision. Halakha prescribes, Agadah suggests. Halakha decrees, Agadah inspires. Halakha is definitive, Agadah is elusive. He is going to place a lot of emphasis on mitzvah, but he wants mitzvah to be in a larger context. And here he goes again. Halakha is the category of quantity, and Agadah the category of quality. Agadah, halakha tells us how much we have to do. Somebody else said, is it one guest or two guests? But Agadah deals with what's immeasurable, telling us how to feel rather than how much. Now in selection 4, if you reduce Judaism to halakha, you dim its light. You pervert its essence, you kill its spirit.
Yep.
It has to go with halakha. Agadah has to. But frequently, that legacy was overlooked and Agadah became subservient to halakha. David Novak says that you get theology from halakha. That is, Agadah is dependent on halakha. That's what he said in his early writings. More recently, Novak will argue that there is a kind of natural law along with halakha. So here too, now, what is the basis of halakha? The statement Moses received the Torah from Sinai. Yet, that statement isn't halakha. Rather, the event at Sinai belongs to the sphere of Agadah. So halakha derives its authority from Agadah. And then again, he's going to talk about this, but I want to just draw you to this idea. Halakha, or the code of conduct, is like the score to a musician. Remember, Heschel's wife is a pianist, he often will use musical metaphors. So you can learn the rules, but the sense of rhythm must come from within. I don't know if he listened to jazz, although much of the way he writes is this kind of, he'll have one idea and then he riffs off of it. So there's a jazz-like quality to his writing. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. And he says, but on the other hand, if you only reduce it to Agadah, then you lose something, you'll destroy it. The surest way to forfeit Agadah is to abolish halakha. He will say this, by the way, in a speech to the Reform rabbis. So it's impossible to have one have supremacy, but rather they have to be in a dialogue. And he now uses a body image. We must neither disparage the body nor sacrifice the spirit. The body is important in Judaism. A mitzvah is both a discipline and an inspiration. And the key is how to maintain a harmony between those two. I'm going to come back to our screen and ask for your reactions to this.
But morality and halakha
Wait,
contradict.
Esther, you're raising your hand. Okay. Go on.
Well, very often you can be halachically right and morally wrong.
That's a different kind of a question.
No,
That's not what he's talking about here.
Then I misunderstood it.
But I will give you an example of how of a dialogue that took place. I think it was in the late 1980s, but it may have been in the 90s. Some of you will remember that there was a plane crash or something in the Andes, and there were people who had to survive in the Andes. Eventually, some of them were rescued. The question was, what did they eat when their prepared foods ran out? And apparently they ate the flesh of their dead companions. Now, two rabbis engaged in a debate about that afterwards. And one said, that's better than eating pork. Why? Because this is not treif if it's not a living creature anymore. And Rabbi Amital from a yeshiva in Israel responded to this American rabbi and said, effectively, are you crazy? Are you nuts? Do you not get what we're talking about? That there is a bigger thing here than just, are you eating kosher or not? So what Heschel is trying to say, and what Rav Amital on some level was saying, is that there are big issues here. Vision, aspiration. Law is not only what you're supposed to do, but it's also supposed to take you somewhere. So that idea of aspirational halakha is really important. And foundational Haggadah, which creates the base for halakha. And that's why if you read this in dialogue with Soloveitchik, you see how even though each of them is concentrating on God, how different their approaches are.
Well, there was a rabbi in Russia. Well, remember they used to take the young boys into the army. And then one of them came to the rabbi and says, the only food we have is pork. What should we do? And the rabbi said, eat it, but don't lick your fingers.
Right. Eat less than you need. You know, so that's
In
an
order
idea.
to survive, you can eat a treif too.
Right. Right. I want to thank you tonight for studying together. I think next week we'll start with the Sabbath and with prayer, and then we'll go into the world of ethics. And thank you for hanging in there. It's not easy stuff.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
I won't sleep tonight. I have a lot to think about.
Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Toda Rabah.
Thank you.
Toda raba lechem.